Are you a medical student and you tried various techniques to memorize mucopolysaccharide composition and none of them seem to have worked so far? Then you are in the right place. Hello all, I'm Dr. Ravi Kishore P, Professor in the Department of Biochemistry at a medical college affiliated to Rajiv Gandhi University of Health Sciences, Bangalore, India. And in this session, we will look at I-monics for mucopolysaccharide composition. But what on earth are these I-monics? I-monics are advanced memory techniques that use stories and images to memorize difficult information. But why on earth should you trust these I-monics? Over the past few years, I have developed these I-monics and taught these I-monics on various topics to hundreds of students in various medical colleges. And students have found these techniques to be highly effective and fun. Why don't you give this a try? So let's look at the table for composition of mucopolysaccharides. These are the various mucopolysaccharides and each of them have an amino sugar and uronic acid. There are some exceptions. We will come to the exceptions a little later. Please note, in this I-monics technique, mucopolysaccharide symbol is shown in a specific tissue, but the same mucopolysaccharide can be present in other tissues too. For example, chondroitin sulfate symbol is shown in cartilage, but chondroitin sulfate is also present in other tissues like bone and tendon, etc. When we learn a language, we need to know the sentences and the words. Similarly, if you are learning I-monics, we need to know certain symbols which act like building blocks. It should not take much time to memorize these things. Once you're done with this, the next part, the main part, becomes very easy. For example, this blue chain represents N-acetyl glucosamine or NAGLU, and this blue chain with a yellow triangle represents N-acetyl glucosamine sulfate. We've used yellow triangle for sulfate because sulfur powder is yellow. Similarly, this pink fence-like structure represents N-acetyl galactosamine, and the same structure with a yellow triangle represents N-acetyl galactosamine sulfate. And this flower-like structure with a red surrounding represents glucuronic acid, and similarly this rhombus-shaped structure with a red surrounding represents iduronic acid, and this green rectangle represents galactose, and this missile-like structure represents sulfated glucosamine. So this is a comprehensive image to help you memorize all these structures. It should not take much time for you to memorize these things because once you're done, it makes it easy for you to memorize the I-monic. And second thing, please note that these structures have nothing to do with the chemistry or composition of each of these amino sugars or uronic acid. This is just for the sake of memorization. You can pause the video, memorize this, and then go ahead. Let's start with the first mucopolysaccharide or Dermatan sulfate. Dermatan reminds us of dermis, a layer in the skin. So we used a skin cell to represent Dermatan sulfate. Adjacent to this skin cell is a bigger skin cell. The composition of Dermatan sulfate is N-acetyl galactosamine sulfate and iduronic acid. Let's try to remember all this through a small simple story. Let's assume this is a Dermatan palace and there's a queen, that is Queen Iduronic acid, that is living in Dermatan palace. She is a very great queen and she rules the kingdom very well. But then she has a lot of enemies that are trying to kill her. So her supporters have built up a big fence-like structure to protect her, and this fence-like structure is made up of N-acetyl galactosamine sulfate. That's about the story. To summarize, the composition of Dermatan sulfate is N-acetyl galactosamine sulfate and iduronic acid. Let's go to the next one. That is heparin. Please note it is not heparan, it is heparin. We used a blood vessel to represent heparin because heparin acts in the blood vessels. The composition of heparin is iduronic acid and sulfated glucosamine. Let's assume this is Heparin Street. Now, Queen Iduronic acid was staying in a palace. She was staying alone. She was bored and one day she sneaked out of the palace to buy some new clothes in the Hep shop in the Heparin Street. Hep shop reminds us of heparin. Since she had come without any of her security, the enemies took advantage of that opportunity and fired sulfated glucosamine missile at her. And the most unfortunate thing happened. So that's about the story. The composition of heparin is hyaluronic acid and sulfated glucosamine. So have a quick look at Dermatan, sulfate and heparin. The common thing between both of them is the uronic acid, that is hyaluronic acid, that is present in both of them. Let's go to the next one. It is Keratan sulfate. Please note it is not keratin, it is Keratan. We used caret to represent Keratan sulfate because both of them sound similar. Keratan and caret. The composition of Keratan sulfate is N-acetyl glucosamine sulfate and galactose. Let's look at the story. N-acetyl glucosamine sulfate and galactose had gone to swim in a place which was infested with sharks, and both of them ended up being chased by a big shark, and they barely saved themselves by climbing up a rope which was thrown on by their good friend Keratan sulfate. So that's about the story. The composition of Keratan sulfate is N-acetyl glucosamine sulfate and galactose. Please note the exception. There is no uronic acid. There is galactose present in the place of uronic acid. Go to the next one, that is chondroitin sulfate. We use this structure to represent chondroitin sulfate because it resembles a portion of the joint. The white portion at the bottom represents the bony portion of the joint, and the light brown portion, it represents the cartilage portion of the joint. Of course, we have exaggerated the cartilage portion of the joint just for the sake of I-monic. The composition of chondroitin sulfate is N-acetyl galactosamine sulfate and glucuronic acid. Let's look at the story. Let's assume this is cartilage street. There's been a big earthquake at the cartilage street and there's been a big crack. Government authorities have put up a big fence-like structure made up of N-acetyl galactosamine sulfate to prevent people from falling into the crack. But then some people are adamant. They want to jump over the fence and see what's in the crack. So government authorities went a step ahead and sealed the crack using a glue-like substance, that is glucuronic acid. So that's about the story. The composition of chondroitin sulfate is N-acetyl galactosamine sulfate and glucuronic acid. Let's go to the next one, that is hyaluronic acid. We used a pool to represent hyaluronic acid because hyaluronic acid is present in synovial fluid. The composition of hyaluronic acid is N-acetyl glucosamine and glucuronic acid. Please note the exception. There is no sulfate here. Let's go to the story. Glucuronic acid was bored of sitting in the crack, so it wanted to chill out. So it sneaked into the pool from behind. And similarly, N-acetyl glucosamine sulfate was stressed after being chased by a shark. It wanted to chill out, so it wanted to enter the pool. But then people at the pool said sulfates are not allowed. So with great sadness, it entered the pool. N-acetyl glucosamine and glucuronic acid became good friends and they were having a good time. But then after some time, N-acetyl glucosamine started missing sulfate. It wanted to go check out sulfate, but then glucuronic acid would not allow it. That's the reason N-acetyl glucosamine was sad. So that's about the story. The composition of hyaluronic acid is N-acetyl glucosamine and glucuronic acid. To learn these I-monics, you can view the content a couple of times and try to recall them without seeing them. This simple recall exercise will help you remember the content for a long time. That's about it. If you like the content in this channel, please subscribe.